Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the second season of In Plain English. I'm your host, Jamie Moffa, and today we are going to be discussing the paper titled The Sensation of Groove is Affected by the Interaction of Rhythmic and Harmonic Complexity by Thomas Matthews et al. Here to discuss this paper with us is our expert, Alex Albury. Alex, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Like Jamie said, I'm Alex. I'm a PhD candidate in psychology at Concordia University in Montreal.
Great. And with us today are our two non-expert guests, SB Pi and Sasha Dmytrenko. SB and Sasha, would you each like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name's SB. I'm a graduate student, a postdoc, or pre-doctoral candidate in the lab of Carolina Lopez at Washington University in St. Louis.
And I'm Sasha Dmytrenko, and I am also a PhD candidate in laboratories of Corey Levine and Mike Diamond at Washington University in St. Louis.
Great. Well, without further ado, let's get into the paper.
Yeah, so I thought to start with, I'd just like to set the backdrop for like my background and maybe hear a little bit more about everyone else's background. Like I said, I'm a student in psychology, but my research is on music cognition. Full disclosure, this paper comes out of my own lab. It's not one of my papers, but it does come from my lab. My supervisor is on it, a former student in the lab is on it, I have collaborators on it, so just put out that conflict of interest there. And I just say that it's a music paper, but I would consider myself a cognitive scientist or a cognitive psychologist, so I'm not a musicologist, I'm not a music theorist, so I'm approaching this more from a cognitive science standpoint and an experience standpoint than maybe a like hardcore music theory standpoint. For in terms of practical experience, I'm a very amateur guitar and piano player, and I think it'd be cool to if everyone here was willing to share like their background or lack thereof of with music or music performance. So Jamie, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I was actually so thrilled that you reached out to me because I am in neuroscience, so kind of like relating to the science aspect of this paper. And I am also a musician. I've played the trumpet for 18 years now, and I'm still playing in a local community band. I've also been teaching myself keyboard during the pandemic, but I'm not very good at it. And I've never had music theory either, so even if it did have music theory, I probably wouldn't understand it.
Yeah, I currently play the string bass with the St. Louis Civic Orchestra and have a history of playing string bass as well as viola and trumpet were sort of my primary triad, but I'm just a lover of music. I love to play any instrument, even for a little while. So we've got like ukuleles, a mandolin in the house. We've got a couple extra horns. It's a musical household.
So I actually, I guess, is one of the people who doesn't play anything. Uh, I do go to the symphony pretty regularly, so I guess I'm on the other side of the stage.
Yeah, perfect. I also really love that term of like the other side of the stage. But yeah, like I said, I am very much a casual musician, let's put it at that. So like Jamie said, this paper is called The Sensation of Groove is Affected by the Interaction of Rhythmic and Harmonic Complexity. As you might guess from this title, we're going to be talking about groove a lot, so I think we should sort of get a handle on what that is. And so as we go through this, I'll sort of walk through the rationale of the paper, why the authors decided to do what they did, and then what they actually did and what they found. In the title, we have this phrase "sensation of groove." So we're the broad or like really really broad question about this paper is sort of where does this sensation of groove come from, and what causes it? A lot of music research about groove, as you might guess, typically focuses on rhythm, but rhythm is only one part of music. There are a ton of different things that go into music, and so one of the things this paper tries to pull apart is what is the difference between rhythm and harmony in music in terms of creating this feeling or sense of groove. And we'll talk more about each of these in a bit. They also want to know is this relationship between rhythm and harmony affected by music experience? So does how much you know about music or how much experience you have with music affect how much you understand either rhythm or harmony, and how much it affects you in terms of how much you feel groove when you listen to music? Like I said, we sort of want to get a handle on what this term groove means. It's sort of a non-specific term, and this is an empirical paper, so we want something more sort of scientific or something that's more quantitative. So is groove a feeling? Is it some aspect of music? Is it an internal thing? Is it an external thing? Can we measure groove? And so in this paper, what the authors do and what we'll talk about a lot is we'll talk about the desire to move along with music. And so this is one interpretation of groove. I'm sure there are many, many more if you ask a musicologist or music theorist. But this paper focuses on groove as the desire to move based on music. And we'll also talk about musical enjoyment or pleasure in general. We have maybe a bit more of a concrete sense with this like desire to move, but that's still sort of an internal feeling. So how does the music come into this? We still sort of have to get a measure of how music affects this desire to move. Just some basic, I guess, music theory aspects that they introduce in the beginning of the paper, things like beat, meter, and rhythm. And I'll quickly give a rough explanation for what those are, and I hope I get these right because I think even music theorists sort of struggle with how to define some of these. But for the sake of this paper, we'll sort of use some standard definitions. So beat, if you've listened to music, you probably heard the word beat before. It's sort of the foundation of a song. It's completely unchanging for the most part. Not that a beat can't change throughout a song, but think of like a metronome that's ticking along or a clock that's ticking along at a constant pace. That you can sort of think of that as a beat. It's very monotonic, or monotonous, and sort of just keeps going. One step up from that is meter, which is sort of like a rhythmic theme in music. It sort of establishes the tone of a piece of music or how the feel of a piece of music. So it's not necessarily the music itself, but it could involve like specific patterns, rhythmic patterns that happen in the music that repeat over and over again, that come back. And so I sort of like this idea of meter as like a rhythmic theme for the piece. And then if you want to take a step further, you could say the actual rhythm, which are the notes themselves or the lyrics that people sing, notes that are played. This is the rhythm. So where do they fall in the music? How long is each note? How short is each note? How much space is there between the notes? This is the actual rhythm of the song. Based on this idea of rhythm and meter, you can sort of manipulate music to change where it falls in that meter of the music, in that tonal sort of foundation of what a song is. And this is where the authors talk about syncopation. So if you're maybe a little bit familiar with music, you've heard the term syncopation, but the idea of syncopation is any events that happens off beat in music. So you imagine you have this established meter in music that you expect certain things to happen. Syncopation actively goes against that established meter. So it's sort of when something happens in music when it's not supposed to, and this can be a good thing. Like it's not bad in any way. Syncopation plays with our expectations. It sort of gives us pleasant surprises. It gives the music some complexity, as we'll hear that buzzword a lot in a little bit. And so syncopation can be good, but there has to be a bit of a balance. There's sort of this sweet spot in the middle where music can be a little bit syncopated. So it adds some sort of complexity to the music. It doesn't, but you go too far, then it becomes a little bit too complicated, sort of weird, hard to follow. If you go the other end, like zero syncopation, then it's probably going to be pretty boring. So there's sort of this sweet spot of how music can change rhythmically. This is sort of the idea for how rhythm affects our expectations in music. And what this boils down to is a broader idea of the relationship between complexity and enjoyment in music. And so we'll talk more about this throughout the piece, but this is a big part of what this paper is about. So what do I mean by complexity? Complexity is in this sense, so if we think of syncopation, adding syncopation to a piece of music adds complexity to it. There's more going on. It's sort of moving away from your established expectations. It's adding in more nuance. And so that's how rhythmic complexity happens with that syncopation. But like I said at the beginning, the authors were also interested in harmony. So just like syncopation adds rhythmic complexity, we can also have harmonic complexity, which is affected by the actual notes in a piece of music. So for listeners that may not have a lot of music experience, in Western music we have a set of patterns and rules that our music follows, and this is in terms of musical keys. So each song has a musical key, which is sort of the tonal reference for it. It determines the general theme or idea of a piece of music, and how much the music sticks to the key that it's in can influence harmonic complexity. So you can play notes that are really, really in the key. They sound like they're supposed to be there. You can play notes that are really out of key on purpose that might be really surprising or sound a bit strange. And just like we had that syncopation with rhythm, where you can sort of add in surprises with music, you can have these extraneous notes with harmony that will add in harmonic complexity.
So is this encompassing both this like harmonic complexity and what we're enjoying from listening to the notes themselves? Is this like notes within chords, or like interval spaces between consecutive notes, or sort of both of those things together? Like, is it less pleasant or more pleasant to listen to like strange and unexpected intervals than strangely stacked chords?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's a big difference between them. It can be hard in terms of the research to in comparing, so what would be, I guess, melody versus harmony. So if you're just looking at, like, maybe imagine like just single notes in a very simple melody, and then so you're just looking at the intervals between each note, or like you said, you could look at it as a harmonic complexity, which is the chords themselves. And then you have two options for that. You could have the intervals between the notes in the chords, or you could have the chord position inside of the key that the piece of music is in. I would say people have tried to study them separately, but they're definitely sort of intermixed. The harmony part of it is kind of hard, so I think a lot of music research sort of struggles a little bit and sort of leans towards the melody side of things, for especially when looking at pitch instead of rhythm. But they definitely both matter. I just think harmony is maybe a bit harder because it's more complicated to measure or study scientifically.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what's sort of the main theme here? So we know that we enjoy music, we know that it can make us want to move, and we think that there's this relationship between complexity and enjoyment in music, whether rhythmic complexity or harmonic complexity. So the authors want to know, how much do rhythm and harmony contribute to the feelings we experience when listening to music, and how does musicianship affect this, which we'll also talk about in a bit. So how did the authors try to figure this out? So they did an online study. So one of the benefits of doing listening only research is that you can do research entirely online if you don't actually need people to do anything really complicated in person. They had a online study. They collected data from 201 people, and for the music and non-musician comparisons that we'll talk about a bit later on, they had subgroups of 58 musicians and 51 non-musicians, which they sort of took from the ends of that 200 people. So if you imagine out of those 200 people, everyone sort of you have a range of musical experience. They wanted like the really hardcore musicians and then the really hardcore not musicians. So they sort of cut out the people in the middle and took people's on the end, so they would have really, really clean samples for musicians and non-musicians. So that's why we start with 200 people for the full sample and then end up with 58 and 51 for the subgroups.
Do you know if that sampling cutoffs was done based on this group, or did they decide up front that, because I think it's like 3 years and 6 years of music, formal music training, like was that decided to actually capture 50 people on each end and cut off 100 in the middle? Or was it just like what they said that they will do, and then at the end, that's how it.
I would imagine they probably decide. I'm not completely sure, but I would imagine they probably decided beforehand. It was more they started with the criteria and then probably ended up with like 50 and 50 rather than they were aiming for 50 and got that.
I was just wondering whether the age came from saying like we want the 25% on each end, or whether they were like we want the time. Thanks.
So I'm sure that it's not easy to define whether someone is a musician or not through the lens of a computer. In this sort of context where they're asking about frequency and then excluding some people, did in the actual participating in the survey, do people find out if they're grouped as a non-musician or as like a hardcore musician, like you said, or is it just sort of all this information's collected, everyone takes the same test?
The latter, yeah. So I would imagine the distinction between musicians and non-musicians was done after the fact. So just during data analysis.
Makes sense.
Since we're talking about the participation, like in people, I just also wanted to point out how, to me, it was a little weird to read. I think the first statement in the people section of the paper says that the computer only saved any information from people who fully participated and listened to all 54 clips. Hence, there are no omissions, which is interesting because then it's like, I don't know. It's like as if we were enrolling in a medical study. It's like, well, we only enrolled people who satisfied the criteria, so we don't know anything about people who didn't. So then I'm not going to report on them. I understand their technical issues with that because you don't know how much they missed, but also it's like there's no data on how, who was more likely to drop out.
Yeah, the sampling bias in general, and especially for online studies, is like a really hot topic because you are, I guess this is true of like sampling bias in general, but especially for online studies where you have much less control over how things happen. I can say as like this isn't my study, but I've done music studies online, and you sort of realize that if you label a study as a music study, and you're having people sort of on a data collection site where they're choosing through a lot of studies, they may be more likely to choose a music study. In general, we have an easy time recruiting people because most people like music, and a lot of times the people who like music are going to do a music study. And so there is a bit of sampling bias there that you do sort of have to think about. And then like the other stuff too of like who doesn't finish it or not is like there are so many like hidden factors that you can't know about. So sort of we sort of get away with it with like trying to like get as many people as we can to hopefully like wash out any of those like weird quirks. But yeah, as like having collected data online, it definitely does happen that you get people who are interested in music doing music studies, which makes sense. That's the sample size, so 200 people. I'll talk about the stimuli they use. And so I realized that stimuli is a bit even a jargon word maybe for some of the listeners, but it's sort of hard to characterize these pieces anyway because they're, as I'll talk about in a minute, they're very short. They're only made of chords. I wouldn't necessarily call them songs because of how short they are. And so I get that stimuli is a bit experimental and cold, but it's kind of the, I think, most accurate term for them. And so they had 54 in total. And so each of them they were all very short. Each of them included one chord that was played 5 times. And they had 3 levels of rhythmic complexity and 3 levels of harmonic complexity. And so the way this worked is that for the rhythmic complexity, like I said, each piece, each stimulus had 5 chords in it, and they varied where those chords fell in the rhythm that was established. So all of them were accompanied by a hi-hat, so sort of as a metronome. A hi-hat is just a basic drum beat that had a standard rhythm that was very clear. So there was sort of this established rhythm that was set the tone or the foundation, and then depending on where the chords fell within that rhythm, it would affect the syncopation of the piece. So you can imagine the chords could fall like directly on each beat. The chords could fall somewhere in the middle. It could fall on a half beat. It could fall even between that. And so there's a lot of variation for where each chord can show up. And that's how they varied rhythmic complexity. And so they had 3 levels of rhythmic complexity, one being very simple, one being more medium, and then one being highly complex, so would sound a bit stranger or a bit out of the traditional rhythm established by that background beat. They also had 3 levels of harmonic complexity. The way they manipulated harmonic complexity is, like I said, they use chords, and they change which notes they use in the chords to change the harmonic complexity. So I'll try to gloss over some of the music theory here, but for just like the rhythmic complexity, they had low, medium, and high. For maybe the low notes, they had very standard chords, so like a 1-3-5 chord for people familiar with music. For a medium, they added in some extra notes, and then for highly complex chords, they added in even more notes that were sort of out of the maybe established key for that chord.
So in the context of this like complexity assignments, is this like targeted sort of toward what we in a Western world are expecting to hear from music, or is this just sort of like stacking random notes on top of each other, and when you add more of them, it's more complex? Like, is it intended to be things that we're used to hearing, but just shorter? Or is it supposed to be like an entirely new set of notes?
Yeah, so I would say it's built on with the assumption of like standard Western music background and experience. So it is supposed to sort of like the low complexity ones will probably sound most normal, maybe a bit boring, but most normal. And so just adding in. So even the highly complex ones don't necessarily sound completely alien.
Mm-hmm.
They still sounded musical. They just sounded a lot different than maybe your average pop song.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
I actually also have a question. Who made these? Like, was it a person, or is there a software that designs these that can just kind of scramble things?
I'm trying to remember now. I think all of these were they were definitely made by a person, but I'm trying to think for the rhythmic complexity they may have. I'm trying to decide where, or I'm trying to remember how they decided where each chord fell within the beat. That might have been computational. They might have done that not necessarily randomly, but pseudo randomly.
I remember them saying though that some of the beats or the more complex beats were based off of like specific rhythms that are typical in particular cultures. Like they mentioned like a samba rhythm or something.
Mm-hmm.
So they at least modeled it off of something, and I don't remember if like sort of within that model it was computer generated or not.
I think they were chosen specifically by the experimenters, so it wasn't random or computer generated. That definitely does happen, even for like some of my own research. You can do that for some music. Or some experimentally designed music. But I'm pretty sure these were specifically made. And it helps that for 3 levels of rhythmic complexity, 3 levels of harmonic complexity isn't a ton, so that's conceivable for one poor graduate student to make. And so based on that, so 3 levels of rhythmic complexity, 3 levels of harmonic complexity. With those 3 levels, if you cross them, you end up having 9 groups of rhythmic and harmonic complexity. So you can imagine you have a low harmonic complexity, low rhythmic complexity, low harmonic complexity, high rhythmic complexity, low medium, etc., for a total of 9 groups. So now we can look at both rhythmic complexity on its own, harmonic complexity on its own, and also the interaction between the two that we'll talk about in a bit. So what did people do actually in this task with these stimuli or with these pieces of music? So participants listened to each in a randomized order. So each person got a new order, just so there's no order effects of how they heard them. And after each, they were asked 2 questions. So how much does this musical pattern make you want to move? And how much pleasure did you experience listening to this musical pattern? Actually, this is a good term for if you don't want to use the word stimuli, they use this word musical pattern for the stimuli, because I think that's the best way to describe it. Like I said, they're not really songs. They're not really, I guess you'd call them pieces of music, but even that doesn't seem right. So like musical pattern is sort of a good way of describing them.
So since these are super short pieces, is there any sort of like priming effect where if you listen to music that's groovy and you're moving to it, and then you listen to like a fragment of notes, that you would be more likely to move to the music? Or do you think that it's sort of going to be that way regardless?
It definitely matters. So I'm smiling now because this is sort of like related to a research project that I'm working on, which is the idea of how does music that you've heard recently or in the same context affect other music? Like, does it bleed into each other, or affect how you experience that music? And so, yeah, it definitely will sort of color your perceptions of how you experience things. The lazy way of just sort of accounting for that is just hoping that things work out by the numbers. That if with 200 people, hopefully that wouldn't be an issue. I'm trying to think of even if you really wanted to like seriously worry about it, I guess you could say hopefully it wouldn't matter too much because it would affect all of the 54 in the same way. It's pretty short. You know, you could maybe make the argument that the ones on the end, you listen to, I don't know, Stevie Wonder beforehand, before you start the task, that maybe by the time you get to the end of it, that some of that effect has gone away. But yeah, for the most part, we would hope that it wouldn't have a huge effect. But yes, music heard in proximity to each other definitely affects other music, or how you perceive other music. From this now, we sort of have all of the pieces of this like research design or research question. So we have harmonic complexity and rhythmic complexity that was determined beforehand by the experimenters based on how they made these musical patterns. And then from the online study, we have ratings of wanting to move from participants and ratings of pleasure from participants. And so that's the sort of main piece or design of the study. And so sort of we can get into what they found. So like I said, based on this, we can look at rhythm on its own, we can look at harmony on its own, or we can look at rhythm and harmony together. We're looking at the effects of these things on feelings of wanting to move and feelings of pleasure. First of all, what they found is, now we have our 3 levels, remember, we have low, medium, and high. So for wanting to move, they found that the medium complexity rhythms tended to make people want to move more. So the medium complexity rhythms had the highest ratings of wanting to move compared to the low and high complexity rhythms.
So when they're going through and evaluating how much you want to move and how much you like the music, are they accounting for how much you've liked music in the past and how much you've liked to move in the past? Like if you're a dancing musician versus if you're Scrooge on a couch?
I sort of glossed over it, but they did have questions about musical experience and music engagement, and also dance experience. So they don't focus on these a lot. They tend to focus in the paper. They focus more on the musicianship side of things, but they do actually include those. But I will say, if I'm mostly sure based on what they've done. So if there are any results for those, they would report them specifically. And for the main results of, say, like rhythmic complexity and harmonic complexity, I'm making the assumption here, but I believe we'll take those factors into account. So they would have controlled for those in the stat side of things. And so, like I said, so for feelings of wanting to move, we sort of see that the medium complexity rhythms have the highest ratings of wanting to move. But if you imagine like the graph that you have a low, medium, and high, you sort of end up with this sort of V-shaped looking result where if you take an average for each group, the average for the medium group is higher than both the low and high complexity groups. So there's sort of, I mentioned this in the beginning, but we're seeing again, there's sort of this sweet spot for complexity and rhythm that tends to make people want to move more. So that's for the rhythm. For the harmonic complexity, we saw that high complexity chords had lower ratings of wanting to move. So there was no difference between the low and medium groups of harmonic complexity. So they didn't seem, those got similar ratings all around. The low and medium groups always seem to be about the same. But when you get into the high harmonic complexity, people had lower ratings of wanting to move there. We can speculate that those are too complicated, they sound too weird, they're hard to follow, and so people give those high harmonic complexity chords, those weird sounding chords with a bunch of ninths or sharps or something in them, that they don't make them want to move as much.
That's interesting. So I remember I played Rite of Spring like once in high school, and I remember it just being like a rhythmic nightmare. It was like meters changing every other second and a lot of like really crazy stuff, which I know is sort of what it's famous for. But by the end of it, we kind of fell in love with it, but it just was like an exposure related thing that we just heard it so many times that finally it became okay. Do you think that is more like an effect of musical training, or do you think that exposing someone with no musical training to like high complexity rhythms for a longer period of time would make them like them more?
Mainly, it's the exposure effect. So I think I can guess what would happen. So you obviously heard that a lot and had to experience it a lot, and so you got more used to it. But I would expect if, say, you heard like a ton of music or a sort of a mix of music, and you heard all of that together, and you heard all of that a bunch of times over and over again, the sort of your relative opinion of each of those pieces of music would stay about the same. So
Okay.
it might change. They might all go up together. They might all go down together. But sort of in relation to each other, they'd probably stay the same. But for your case, where yeah, you're hearing one thing over and over and over again, I can see you maybe getting used to it because it's not what sounded strange in the beginning isn't going to sound as strange.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that there was a point in discussion that somewhat addressed this that I found interesting because I approach this, especially since you say that these stimuli are generated and kind of not really like music, from what it sounds like. I was expecting it to be kind of an intrinsic feature of how we perceive sound or sound and patterns, whether we like certain complexities, whether we want to move to them. But then there was an argument that, well, the low and medium complexity in terms of harmony is more seen in the groovy music. So that's why we kind of don't expect a high complexity harmony in groovy music. So we didn't necessarily rate it poorly. And to me, it was interesting because it's effectively a question of intrinsic versus extrinsic, kind of what you guys just discussed, whether you can like train somebody to like it.
They make the point, like you said in the discussion, that some of these, especially for the harmonic ones, may actually be more common versus the high complexity harmonic chords, and so those may sound more out of place. And so this is always a challenge when like designing stimuli for any sort of music experiment is how much does it fit in with people's established expectations, how far can you push it to the edges of those extremes before it becomes not music anymore. Because you can imagine you can have a random grouping of notes and call it a chord, but if there really goes too far outside like the established musical rules, is it really accord anymore.
I wonder, in the context of like age that someone learns to speak music, or to play music, so thinking sort of within the musician subgroup specifically, I wonder if someone who like grew up playing like Suzuki violin since they were 4 would perceive musical stimuli differently than someone who maybe like started playing guitar in college. That like maybe one person grew up learning music when they didn't like necessarily want to and learn to love it versus someone loved it first and then learned it. I wonder, is there sort of any research that looks at that relationship?
Yeah, definitely. There's a big sort of subset of research on music experience and age of exposure or age of start that sort of like parallels a lot of the bilingualism and second language learning literature. Like there could be like sort of a bit of a split at some point. You can like group people into early trained versus late trained musicians. So and there's some research suggesting that definitely matters. There's this idea of sensitive periods, the idea that you're more susceptible or more open to learning things at an early age or up to a certain point. That definitely matters. Or you could just look at it as a full continuum of like how much music experience do you have overall. And for this, there is some research that says young and old adults may treat music differently or process music differently. I'm drawing from another paper here. There's some research that suggests a little bit that maybe older persons are more likely to process music or make musical predictions based on musical structure, like key, so like a key a piece of music is in, whereas young adults are more likely to use more lower level features like just pitch intervals, so the difference between pitches of different notes. So with the idea being that older adults have much more experience with music casually throughout their lives, and so maybe they're making predictions from more like established music rules, whereas younger adults are making them more of from just sensory experience or like the raw input.
Huh, that's really interesting. So, do you feel like younger adults in the context of this study would be more likely to show the effects that we see? I know that's totally speculation, but
I don't know if there'd be any different. I'm trying to remember. These are probably all mostly young adults anyway.
I think the median age was like 34 or something.
Back to the overall summary of the results. So we said we sort of had this relationship where for rhythm, we see that the medium rhythm complexity tends to have higher ratings of wanting to move. For harmonic complexity, we see that the low and medium groups are basically the same, but for the high harmonic complexity, we see a drop in that they have lower ratings of wanting to move. So we can say those high harmonic complexity is less likely to make someone want to move when listening to music. We can now look at the same thing for the ratings of pleasure. Remember, the participants answered 2 questions. So how much does this make you want to move? And how pleasurable was this musical pattern? Basically, we see very, very similar results for the pleasure ratings as the wanting to move ratings, almost identical, that we see the medium complexity rhythms having the highest pleasure rating, so people like the medium complexity rhythms best, more than the low or high complexity. So we're again seeing this sweet spot for pleasure, just like we did for feelings of wanting to move. And then for harmonic complexity, we also see that typically low and medium harmonic complexity tend to have about the same ratings of pleasure, and the high harmonic complexity has lower ratings of pleasure. So we see sort of the same and then a bit of a drop when we get into those weirder sounding chords. Those are like the main results are the rhythm and harmonic complexity. What the authors wanted to ask is that, okay, maybe we have this feeling of wanting to move from music, and we have this feeling of pleasure we get from music. Is there a direct relationship between harmonic and rhythmic complexity and wanting to move in terms of groove, or do these things just affect how much we like music, and then that in turn affects how much that feeling of wanting to move? So this is where they did what's called a mediation analysis, which is basically looking at is there a direct relationship between two things, or is there some intermediary factor that's affecting it behind the scenes?
So it doesn't exactly say what it is that would be mediating an extra effect. It only says there is something else from this sort of analysis. Like you can figure out there's something else that's happening.
Typically, you have something in mind. For example, in this case, they're asking, does rhythmic and harmonic complexity actually lead to the feeling of wanting to move? So in this case, we're focusing on that wanting to move feeling specifically. And so we know that rhythm and harmonic complexity do affect that based on the results we just talked about. So they does affect it somehow. But what they're trying to know is, do rhythm and harmony actually affect that feeling of wanting to move, or do rhythm and harmony affect how much we like music, and then how much we like the music then affects how much we want to move to the music. So based on mediation analysis, they were saying that, okay, rhythm and harmony actually don't do anything for making us want to move. They're not what really matters. It's actually what pleasure that matters, and they sort of affect pleasure, which then affects wanting to move.
So I understand that we look at these two parameters as, we change because you play different pieces to your participants, right? You change complexity of rhythm and harmony. So those are your variables. And then you take the readout of pleasure and wanting to move. How do you assess whether, let's say, change in harmony causes change in pleasure, so you like music more, which makes you move, versus it makes you move and that makes you like the music more?
You're sort of like flipping the variables to say, okay, are we actually sure this thing affects this thing?
In your brain, like movement, I have read about other studies that are like, movement is pleasurable. People like moving. I can see the direction going the other way too, where like complexity affects how much you want to move, and if you want to move more, then you find it more pleasurable because you're like, oh yeah, I'm dancing and having fun, as opposed to like the other way around, which I think was what the paper was trying to see, whether or not the causality went that way, saying complexity changes how much you like it, and then that changes how much you want to move.
This is a really interesting question and seems like a really obvious question, and I'm wondering, I feel they must have thought about it at some point. But for the most part, you're right, this paper only focuses on it in one direction of like, we're interested in that feeling of wanting to move. That is the end goal, and then we're interested in how we get there. What did they actually find with this? Again, we're looking at, do rhythmic and harmonic complexity actually lead to the feeling of wanting to move, or does it just affect pleasure, which then affects wanting to move? What they found is that even when they accounted for pleasure, so how much how much people liked the piece of music, rhythmic complexity still influenced feelings of wanting to move. So even when they took pleasure or how much the participants enjoyed it into account, rhythm still mattered for that feeling of wanting to move. So in this sense, rhythm is giving something else other than just pleasure. It did affect pleasure, so it definitely did affect pleasure, because in the analysis they talk about how sort of the strength of that relationship between rhythm and wanting to move sort of decreases a little bit when you take pleasure into account, but it's still there. So this idea that rhythm is providing something separate or something in addition to just pleasure. For harmony, on the other hand, they found that when we took pleasure into account, the effect of harmony on wanting to move disappeared. Or in this case, not completely disappeared, but in the context of the paper became not statistically significant. Rhythm, it seems, provides something extra or in addition to pleasure in terms of making us want to move. But for harmony, or harmonic complexity specifically, it seems like harmonic complexity affects how much we like music, and then that in turn sort of affects how much we want to move to music.
That makes sense. So in this context, is that sort of to say that like a really cool drum beat that might not have harmonic complexity but is rhythmic could still make you want to move, but like no, just like some strange notes wouldn't necessarily do that unless they also brought you pleasure first?
Right. And this does sort of say that feeling of wanting to move is really tied to rhythm.
Nobody's gonna get down to a really, really good chord.
Yeah.
Or even like a really cool ballad that doesn't have any rhythm to it. It might be a great series of notes, but no rhythm is probably not going to make you want to move that much. Okay, so last thing I'll talk about is the group comparison between musicians and non-musicians. One very interesting thing that is sort of just a small point that I thought was interesting to point out was that there were no differences in musicians and non-musicians in their reports of dance and groove engagement. So they had some questions related to dancing and sort of experience or engagement with groove, and there was no significant difference between musicians and non-musicians in that, at least for these questions. So I think it's interesting just to say that musicians and non-musicians seem to have similar experiences of these things, at least for this sample for these questions. For the differences in based on complexity and wanting to move, so musicians showed sort of a more peaked relationship between wanting to move and rhythmic complexity, meaning that if you imagine that low, medium, high grouping, we already said that we know that the medium complexity rhythms were liked more and had higher ratings of wanting to move, and they found that in general for musicians compared to non-musicians, that sort of difference was even greater. So musicians tended to like the medium complexity rhythms even more than non-musicians.
Do you think that's just because musicians have more defined expectations?
Yeah, I think interestingly, they also seem to report wanting to move to the high complexity even less. I'm not sure if that difference was significant, but that's actually surprising to me. I would have thought that musicians would be more open to the high complexity.
But they also pointed out, right, that overall musicians enjoy music more, like the amount of pleasure that everything elicited in musicians was higher.
Yeah, so if the when they just looked at the pleasure ratings, just like the what is the average pleasure ratings for the musician group and the non-musician group, regardless of any of the complexity stuff or the harmonic complexity stuff, musicians did show slightly higher ratings of pleasure than the non-musicians.
This is sort of going back to the procedure, but when they were hearing these fragments of music, were they also seeing what the music would have looked like on sheet music, or was it only with their ears?
I'm pretty sure I don't think they were seeing the music. I really doubt they were seeing the actual music. So in general, that sums up the main idea of the results. So again, like I said, we see that it seems that maybe rhythm plays a primary feeling or a primary role in generating feelings of groove or specifically wanting to move in the case of this study, whereas harmony plays an indirect role by influencing how much we enjoy music. Musicians seem to be more susceptible to the effect of rhythm complexity compared to non-musicians, so they show those stronger effects for the medium complexity rhythms, and like we just talked about, they report higher overall ratings of pleasure. I think this is pretty interesting that it says that sort of rhythm has this stronger effect or stronger influence in feelings of wanting to move, whereas maybe harmony is more related to just pleasure and not wanting to move. And I think it's interesting to talk about, and the authors talk about this in the discussion. Why do we see this relationship between rhythmic complexity and wanting to move? So why do we see this thing where we have low complexity rhythms being ranked low in terms of how much they make us want to move, high complexity rhythms being ranked low and how much they make us want to move, and whereas medium, we see these much higher ratings. So medium complexity rhythms make us want to move a lot more. And in the discussion, the authors talk a lot about what's commonly called this inverted U-shaped relationship between complexity and wanting to move. So if you imagine sort of plotting all of this on a graph where you have complexity down at the bottom on the x-axis, and then you have feelings of wanting to move on the y-axis, and you were to draw it out, you would see sort of this upside down U-shape showing that on the low end we don't like it as much, or we don't doesn't make us want to move as much, As we go towards the medium end, we sort of go up, we want to move more, but then as we go too far into the complexity side of things on the higher side, we sort of go back down again, and so it doesn't make us want to move as much. And this is pretty common for both rhythm and is also studied in harmony and melody, although we don't see that as much of a clear relationship for harmony in this study. One of the reasons that they speculate and that a lot of the research speculates why we enjoy this is related to sort of prediction, surprise, and expectation in music. Sort of this idea that I've talked about already of there being a sweet spot right in the middle that sort of works best for levels of surprise. If we think about when we listen to music, whenever we listen to a piece of music, we're making predictions about what's going to happen, no matter what, no matter if you have zero music experience. If you're listening to music, whether you're doing consciously or subconsciously, you are making predictions, or your brain is making predictions about what's going to happen based on your lifetime of exposure to music. Because you've gone throughout your life hearing music, you probably have some prior exposure to music, and you probably have some prior expectations of how music should sound. So whenever we listen to music, we have these expectations for what's going to happen next, and music can either stick to our expectations or can deviate from them. How much that happens affects how we sort of experience music. And so this is directly related to complexity. So complex music is more likely to deviate from these expectations, whereas simple music is more likely to stick to them. But we talked about before, some surprises can be a good thing. So it's part of why we enjoy music, is that we sort of like the pleasant like push and pull of expectation surprise. But if we go too far, we talked about music sort of becomes too weird, it's too hard to predict, it sort of sounds strange. If we go back the other way and music is too predictable, then it's way too boring, there aren't any surprises at all, and so we don't like it. So that's why we sort of get this like sweet spot in the middle where there are some surprises, but the music isn't so complex that it's too hard to follow. And so that's one of the reasons why we think we see this relationship where here specifically for rhythm, we see like medium complexity rhythms being more liked than either high or low complexity rhythms.
Are people trying to do this similar research but with like brain imaging at the same time? Like having people be in an fMRI and playing them these clips of music and seeing differences in how different regions of their brains light up?
Absolutely. Yeah. There are definitely a lot of fMRI studies mostly that look at music and pleasure and music and reward. In fact, I should say there is this paper, there is literally a follow-up to this paper, which is an fMRI paper of a very similar concept, and there are lots of other ones too. That role of predictions that I just described, we can look at that as a theory standpoint. There's also a matching neuroscience standpoint, which is predictive coding. So predictive coding is a theory about sort of how the brain works and makes predictions, and it's this idea that the brain is trying to be as efficient as possible and minimize error as much as possible. So it's trying to make predictions about what happens in the world, and if something goes against those predictions, that's where surprise comes from. And then sort of your internal model of prediction in your brain sort of recalibrates and takes in new information and says, okay, well, now we'll try to make sure that doesn't happen again in the future. And that can also be why you sort of get bored with things as you get used to them, maybe.
Okay, so I'm finding that some part in this discussion looks at this development of auditory motor networks. So I guess, number one, am I getting this right? I think I'm understanding that means that there's some like connection between what you're hearing and your motor response. Is that something you could talk more about? I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. This is a like huge subfield, and like I said, my research is actually related to musical pleasure and instrument learning. So that's a direct link between sort of pleasure and motor learning. The general idea is that we know that music makes us feel good. Music can make us feel pleasure. We know that we have these predictions based on music, and prediction and surprise is what makes us feel pleasure. But another place where prediction comes in music is if you're playing an instrument, you are planning ahead. You're planning into the future whenever you're playing any sort of instrument. And so there's a direct link between sort of this like prediction, these predictive processes in music, and your ability to play music. And so we know that there's prediction is related to playing. We know that prediction is related to reward based on everything we talked about. So you can sort of mash them together and assume that reward is also related to motor learning, which is getting into what my research does.
So at the end, it sort of says this thing about, which makes just like all vibes, no science sense, that the statistical approach and the way that musicianship is defined can really impact how you're seeing the effects of musical training in these kinds of studies. What is the, like, as a scientist that studies this on the day to day, like, what does it look like to try to define these parameters? Like, how do you do that?
So the main results that we talked about today were like musicians versus non-musicians. So we talked about at the very beginning how they created these subsamples and they had these very clean samples of musicians and non-musicians. And so that's one way to do it. But they also looked at the results in terms of just musicianship on a continuous scale. So rather than dividing it into two groups, just looking at it as a continuous variable. It definitely depends on like a research question standpoint of like what you're trying to answer and what you're trying to tell. There's like a broader debate in science now about if you go on like scientific Twitter, you'll see things like don't dichotomize a continuous variable, meaning don't split something into two groups if you don't have to. Just use the full range of the scale. There's definitely a debate, so it's going to depend case by case on like what is the question you're trying to answer. Are you looking at this like continuous change over time? Do you need this like finer grained results, or do you really want to look at a like specific group? So for example, if you wanted to look at non-musicians versus like concert composers or orchestral musicians, then you'd have like really distinct groups. Or maybe you are interested on this like gradual change over time of experience. So it really depends on the question you're trying to answer.
So, summarizing the findings, do you think that that is just a piece of like our understanding of the subject, or do you think it actually can be helpful for people who are creating music, trying to understand music, trying to decide what kind of music to put to accompany different things? Or are people already doing that? Like, is it embedded? Are these findings effectively embedded into the ways people write jazz music, where you kind of know that to make it groovy, you have to do these three things? And we finally were able to codify that.
Yeah. I think this is a cool question. I think in some ways that is what has happened recently. So this idea of like prediction and expectation and surprise in music, I mean, like music theorists have been doing this or have like talked about this for decades at this point, and musicians have probably in some way or another, whether consciously or not, known about this for centuries because they create music that sort of generates these responses. In some ways, we've sort of, I guess, moved in terms of like an implicit understanding of what this processes are to maybe a more music theory understanding where we talked about things like prediction, surprise, etc., and now to a more like quantitative understanding where we are, like you said, codifying it or testing it empirically. So it is sort of building on things that are established or trying to prove things that have been theorized for a while now.
It's interesting that, we only now are trying to understand something that people have been doing for so long. Having unlimited resources in terms of both finances and participant enrollment, how would you have designed an experiment to answer the same questions that others have?
One of the things I like to do, and I think we're sort of moving towards that in general, would be to test this with more, I guess, realistic or more common everyday music. And that has been done, although but it, as you can imagine, it gets a lot harder because music is so different across the span that it really becomes hard to like quantify or measure specific things across different songs. And of course, if I have unlimited money, that I'm gonna stick everyone in an fMRI scan in an MRI scanner. So if I have the opportunity.
It was interesting because one of my ideas on that front was also maybe kind of tell people that when they're doing the survey or whatever you want, they can just move and kind of quantify not the desire to move, but actually like them moving to music by like video recording them. And I'm sure there is software that can.
I feel like I'm gonna groove to music all day, and then as soon as you put a camera on me, I'm going to be so stoic you would not believe.
So I will say I think some of the authors of this study are doing a similar follow-up where they're asking people to just to rate or to indicate where on their body like it makes them want to move, and then rate on a scale of like how much it wants to move. So they are looking at that a little bit, not more, again, more self-reported, so not, maybe not as accurate, but still a bit more fine-grained.
I wonder what that would look like in the context of musicianship for people that play different instruments. Like when I played trumpet in a group, like at most I'm tapping a foot, but when I play string bass, I can move my whole upper body while I play. And so I feel like depending on what I'm listening to and sort of my background musically, it can affect like the types of ways that I would move to music. I wonder if that's sort of experienced by others as well.
Yeah, it goes back to that like auditory motor integration thing.
So I just wanted to ask, what was one like really cool takeaway you had from this paper, or a cool application of this kind of research that you could see in the future?
We talked about it a little bit, so it's interesting to see that musicians had like higher ratings of pleasure than non-musicians. So I guess someone who's a really good musician or a really good music theorist, much better than I am, could take this, and you can actually, the study is all available online. The stimuli for it are available online, at least the chords themselves, not necessarily audio files. You could maybe incorporate this into how you make music. Or for me personally, like being a music researcher, I sort of find it fun to like think about these things when I listen to music. Sometimes it doesn't, I find like it doesn't take anything out of the experience for me. It just sort of makes me ask interesting questions about like why I like certain things, and is there a reason that I like certain music over other music. So that's sort of like, from my research, I sort of like have that fun like experience with music.
So, sort of the flip side of that, do you think that you could use this kind of thing to design like distinctly unpleasant stimuli to get someone to say evacuate a building?
I don't know if we could get something that was that bad. I mean, there's definitely a lot of work in with like computationally generated music. I'm sure there's definitely stuff that you can say like, given enough data from enough people, you could start to like make predictions about what people like and what people don't like. I'm sure like this is what Spotify does behind the scenes somewhere.
Yeah, when I first started reading this paper, it immediately took me back to playing in jazz band in high school, and how at the like front there was always like two or three old guys in Hawaiian shirts that were just like jamming out, dancing, having a great time. And then there were also in the same audience like listening to the same music some people who would just sit there like completely deadpanned. And so there's always a little part of me that wondered like why some people are really feeling it and some people just don't seem to. And I thought it was really cool to see like specifically this like figure that diagrams out the direct versus indirect interaction, and how the harmonic is indirect but the rhythmic is direct. Because I think no vibes all, or no science all vibes. I understand why that would make sense because of the same sort of things. Like I can hear a beautiful ballad and love it, but I don't necessarily want to like groove and jam and tap my foot to it. But if I hear a really cool rhythm that isn't really even any notes, I could definitely find myself doing that. And so it's cool, I think, when we can use science to explain things that we experience every day. I always love it when sort of the science checks out with my intuition. And it was really neat trying to see. I'd never really considered like, how do you even define groove or harmony or meter as scientists instead of just musicians? And so I think this is like really neat and must have taken a whole lot of thought power from a whole lot of people to make this happen.
I think for me, the part that was like a big takeaway is that our brains don't necessarily like things that are too complex in any direction, which you would kind of expect, but it's, again, a nice confirmation that there is some limit to what we would groove to and enjoy in general.
Personally, I'd really like to see if you could do either a video or like EMG, like muscle recordings of people while they're doing this. I want to see if how people rate how much they want to move actually tracks with how much they do move.
That would be cool, but but it's interesting. Like as we talked about, like it will be hard, right? You know, tapping a foot is technically grooving, right? But if you're recording like shoulder movements, that might not be reflected.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining me for this first episode of our second season.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been great.
Does anyone have anything to plug before we go? Social media, paper coming out, anything like that?
And you can find me on Twitter easily at Albury_Alex. That's ALBURY_Alex. And if you're interested in all this stuff about like prediction, how we learn about music, somewhere on my Twitter you'll probably find I wrote a piece for the conversation about how we learn about music and how we experience music in the world, called something like "You know more about music than you think you do," or "You're not tone deaf and you know more about music than you think."
Great. Well, thanks to the three of you again for being on the show, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in to the first episode of the second season of In Plain English. Once again, we have been discussing the paper titled "The Sensation of Groove is Affected by the Interaction of Rhythmic and Harmonic Complexity" by Thomas E. Matthews et al. We've been discussing this paper with our expert, Alex Albury, and our guests, S.B. Pai and Sasha Dmytrenko. As always, you can find this paper for free to download on our website at inplainenglishpod.org. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Plain English Sci. That's PLAINENGLISHSCI. Make sure to subscribe to In Plain English on Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. And you can become a supporter of this podcast on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and tune in next month for another episode of In Plain English.